Hi, my name is Kristen Crispin, and I'll be reading part 3 of a memo I was asked to write in June of this year on the consequences of apartheid in Israel, meaning the systematic ethnic discrimination against the Palestinians that has been existing for decades. So I'm writing through the whole memo today. It's 4 a.m. This is part 3. I have 16 consequences to this apartheid in Israel and to supporting this. 16 negative consequences. This part 3 I'm entitling Reforming Fronts of Conflict Amongst Palestinians and AIPAC's Undemocratic Control. So this is consequence number 13. Oh, and I've been holding up this map to make sure everybody understands what's going on, where things are going. Here's Israel. Here's the Jordan River. On the west bank of the Jordan River, we have the West Bank, occupied territory. Golan Heights and the Gaza Strip. These purple areas are all occupied illegally by Israel. The West Bank is where Palestinians, their homes are being bulldozed, and they have been for months, or maybe longer, and the Gaza Strip is where the war is right now. But for 16 years, 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza have been subjected to a blockade by the Israeli government, so they can't even easily get water and electricity for 16 years. And they say that, and the Israeli government and U.S. is saying, oh, this was unprovoked. Hamas's strike on Israel, it was completely provoked. How can you say, if 2.3 million people are blockaded in Gaza for 16 years, that's not provoking? So I'm going to be looking at consequence 13, 14, and 15 to the system of apartheid in Israel, the discrimination against the Palestinians. Consequence 13, neglecting the need to non-violently resolve conflicts amongst Palestinians. Now, in the first video, I talked about factions and fronts of conflict amongst the Israeli people, because my point is, we've got the main conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians, or the Israeli government and the Palestinians. But amongst the Palestinians there are conflicts, amongst the Israelis there are conflicts. So we've already talked about conflicts amongst the Israelis and even amongst Zionists. So now we'll be looking at conflicts amongst Palestinians. The fronts of hostility and conflict fester within the Palestinian side as well, over goals, the role of Islam, attitudes toward Israel, historical experiences, geographical origin, and socioeconomic class, including the past role of wealthy Palestinians in selling land to Jewish immigrants. Palestinian factions Hamas and Fatah have killed each other's members in extremely hateful conflicts. And when I mentioned fronts of conflict in part 1, my point of demonstrating all these multiple fronts of conflict is that it doesn't make sense to all group together and fight the big war to defeat this other side, labeled evil. Because even if you were to get rid of all the Palestinians, or even if you're able to get rid of all the Israelis, those who are left, they'd fall out amongst each other, because there's conflicts amongst them too. So you want to have a pattern, a habit of how you handle fronts of conflict, and you want to handle them non-violently. You want to handle them with cooperative dialogue, with really listening to the other side and really trying to get in their shoes, and also expressing yourself and your own side. Since 2007, the Palestinian civil war has persisted between Hamas and Fatah and resulted in a split of the Palestinian Authority established in 1994. Hamas, founded in 1987, was originally a Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. Fatah, a Palestinian guerrilla movement created in the 1950s, was founded with a goal of regaining territory and sovereignty from Israel. It was led by Yasser Arafat, who lived from 1929 to 2004, who later was elected chairman of the umbrella group, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, in 1969. So Yasser Arafat of Fatah led the PLO. And I'll add a brief note here to this memo, because I've been studying the Middle East for a few decades, since 9/11. And I'd like to say that the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the origin of Hamas was originally a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is founded on many positive principles of high integrity, and this is not talked about in the U.S. It's always painted as evil or bad or extremist. This movement has been poorly understood and portrayed in the United States. I won't discuss it further here, but it is included in my manuscripts that I hope to publish, and I find it is founded on many more positive values and goals than negative. And when it was founded in 1928 in Egypt, as a reaction to the westernization going on, extreme westernization, and sudden, in Egypt and in Turkey, and also it was a response to the loss of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. And people needed, it was founded as an apolitical social and cultural group to promote moral and social reform. And even many Americans don't like all the westernization. They don't necessarily like everything that we're bombarded with in our culture. There's a certain culture that comes through, like on the TV, or I'm not sure where it all comes from, but Americans don't even like all aspects of westernization. So why it should be forced upon these other nations so quickly, and without a sense of being select about what you like or don't like about westernization. But see, the same thing's happening now with globalization. There's this assumption that anyone who really is a good guy will like globalization, but there has to be attention to the fact that there are negative aspects to cultures also. And so another thing that the Muslim Brotherhood resisted was oppression, like in Egypt. I mean, they were against the dictatorship, the arbitrary arrest, executions, torture. How can you look on the Muslim Brotherhood as evil for fighting oppression? And the Islamists, who are Muslims who would like their governments to be founded on the Sharia, which is, it includes the Muslim law and the Muslim customs. That's also, the Islamist movement is looked upon as bad guys, just crazy extremists, and they're not. There's a variety amongst them, and most are very peaceful also, but there are, I write about it in my works. There are a lot of very positive values, and even some American scholars are saying if democracy is going to come to some of these dictatorial places like Egypt, it's going to come by way of the Islamist movement, because the Islamists are actually the main ones standing up against dictators and oppression. It's a lie when like Bush, in the 2006 National Security Strategy, he described terrorists as tyrants. But they're fighting tyranny. Now, I'm not saying there aren't tyrannical impulses within some terrorist organizations, but in general, they're fighting tyranny. So we hear it all backwards. There are certainly, you'll find negative things in the Muslim Brotherhood, just like you will in any organization. But believe me, it's been poorly portrayed, and there's a lot positive behind it. So it's the same with Hamas. It's really important to see the positive motivations behind it and the positive parts of the goals. I'll continue reading now from my memo. A major source of conflict between the two groups, Hamas and Fatah, is their attitude towards the benefits and dangers of engaging in negotiations with Israel, as opposed to continuing armed conflict. Fatah believes in negotiating with Israel and has ruled out any form of attack. Hamas, however, believes in using armed resistance and feels that Fatah doesn't stand for any principles. The fear of Hamas is that negotiations between the Palestinian Authority and Israel would only be an unjust sellout of the Palestinian cause for the personal benefit of Fatah's political leaders. And again, I'm in favor of non-violent handling of fronts of conflict. So it's nice that Fatah believes in negotiating and has ruled out forms of attack. But notice, Hamas believes in using armed resistance because it feels that Fatah doesn't stand for any principles. So the big point there is the principles. If Hamas knew that negotiations would stand for principles, including lack of oppression, equality, then it wouldn't need to resort to violence. Because the Islamists aren't about violence, they're about principles, and a lot of these principles are very good. Another thing that the Islamists do in the Muslim Brotherhood did was create like soup kitchens and medical care. They really care about poverty, like Mohammed Atta, the pilot in 9/11, the first pilot. He was enraged at the Egyptian government's neglect of the poor. So you don't hear about these humane motivations behind in the terrorist minds. And we've got to catch those, be aware of them. Because if those are paid attention to, then the terrorists won't feel the need to resort to violence. It's not that simple, but it's close to being that simple. Distrust in negotiations is not merely a ploy of those who love violence. There can be valid reasons to distrust bargain makers. After all, the Oslo Accords of 1993 and 1995 between the PLO's Yasser Arafat and Israel's Yitzhak Rabin, for which they were awarded a Nobel Peace Prize, were widely considered by Palestinians and other Muslims, including 9/11 pilot Mohammed Atta, to be a sellout to Israel of Palestinian goals and grievances. And get this, following the Accords, Palestinians lost more territory. Their economy and job prospects further declined, and Arafat used the aid he received to boost up his security forces to use against Palestinians. Israel's insistence that Arafat rein in Hamas only aggravated his oppressive tactics against Palestinians, thus undermining Palestinian support for the PLO and undermining chances for peace and harmony amongst Palestinians, since the violent imposition of control naturally undermines the growth of non-violent understanding, dialogue, and peace. So trying to rein in Hamas through violence, that's not the way to go. That's the way to create more violence. The way to respond to Hamas is look at what their positive motivations or goals are and try to meet their unfulfilled legitimate needs. Arafat imposed upon Palestinians a corrupt and authoritarian regime, press censorship, and security forces that committed brutal interrogations and arbitrary arrests to silence any opposition to Arafat. In short, while a non-violent negotiation with a former enemy can sound and even be wonderful and peaceful, it can also be a selfish deal in which a leader achieves little or nothing for his people, acquires power, status, money, and a peace prize for himself, and even puts his own people's lives in danger. Efforts at reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah continue to be hindered by the U.S. and Israeli governments, who have pressured Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the State of Palestine and Palestinian National Authority since 2005, to oppose reconciliation. So they put pressure on him to oppose reconciliation. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, an advocate of Jabotinsky's aggressive form of revisionist Zionism, which we talked about in Part 2, has stated that Israel will never make peace with Hamas, as if the people of Hamas are less than human and possess utterly invalid grievances. And that's how they're being portrayed by Israel and by some Americans. Israel's government, which opposes any inclusion of Hamas within the Palestinian Authority, the PA, seems to have doomed the PA with a fate of eternal conflict and nothing but a choice of enemies. Make peace either with Israel or with Hamas, but not both. As a result of the conflict between Fatah and Hamas, amplified by the tension driven between Palestinians by U.S. and Israeli support for Mahmoud Abbas, violent relations exist between the Palestinian Authority security forces and Palestinians. The Palestinian Authority, which is Fatah led, has routinely killed Palestinian civilians, including demonstrators and journalists, without charges or fair trial. Torture by the PA is widely used. Journalists are intimidated into signing pledges to refrain from covering issues that are critical of the PA. So if a journalist wants to write about the torture of the PA, they can't, or they're going to get tortured or killed. Now, how can you support Oslo Accords that create this kind of relationship amongst Palestinians, and that create an authoritarian relationship? The Palestinian Human Rights Monitoring Group reported that 16% of Palestinian civilian deaths. I'm just trying to time this so I don't go too long. 16% of Palestinian civilian deaths caused by Israeli and Palestinian security forces between 1993 and 2003 were caused by Palestinian security forces. They killed fellow Palestinians either for helping Israelis, for speaking out against Arafat, or for belonging to a rival gang. You've got awful human dynamics going on here. Charged by Israel with keeping Hamas in line, the Fatah-oriented PA is much more violent than it would need to be if there were peace between Hamas and Fatah. The Human Rights Watch report of 2018 was equally critical of both the PA, the Palestinian Authority of Fatah, and Hamas. So how can people be saying, oh, Hamas is evil? I read one Israeli official was saying Hamas is like ISIS, which we've been trained to associate with crucifixions. Hamas arrests, but the Human Rights Watch report was critical of both the PA and Hamas equally in 2018. Hamas arrests people associated with Fatah. The PA arrests not only people associated with Hamas, but also Fatah rivals of Mahmoud Abbas. Shawan Jabarin, executive director of the Palestinian human rights organization Al-Haq, which means the truth, and a member of the Human Rights Watch Middle East, remarks, quote, "The fact that Israel systematically violates Palestinians' most basic rights is no reason to remain silent in the face of the systematic repression of dissent and the torture Palestinian security forces are perpetrating," end quote. Again, by Fatah, supposedly the good ones amongst the Palestinians. And Hamas is supposedly all the Palestinians are bad guys, right? But Hamas is supposedly the worst of the worst. Human Rights Watch found that few Palestinian security officers have been prosecuted, and none have been convicted for wrongful arrest or torture. And that was in 2018. None arrested for wrongful arrest or torture, even though that's what they do. Jabarin is right. Horrible human relations need to be fixed at every front of conflict between Palestinians and Israelis, amongst Palestinians, and amongst Israelis. If you repair human rights only at one front of conflict, you're not significantly building your human capacity for peaceful, constructive relations across fronts. You're only channeling the hatred, anger, and cruelty into other fronts. The idea is to get rid of cruelty, violence, and injustice at every front of conflict. And it's the same with Biden, who's saying so indignant about the loose gun control laws, saying, oh, this is awful, all these these gun killings in the United States, while he's shipping off billions of dollars of guns to Ukraine. It's the same dynamics he's promoting over there. Horrible human relations he's promoting over there. But oh, it's supposed to be, we're supposed to have nice relations amongst Americans, but promote bad ones over there? No, it's not going to work. You've got to create positive human relations at every front of conflict. You need to practice it at every front. It doesn't mean you can't get angry with people or disagree, but you don't get violent, and you really try to understand and listen to the other point of view. Jabarine is right. Oh, I said that already. Okay, as Erica Wack reports, without excusing violence amongst Palestinians, it must be acknowledged that the occupation and war conditions in which Palestinians live breeds internal hostility amongst Palestinians. External tension with Israel breeds internal tension amongst Palestinians. And PLO efforts at negotiating with Israel that exclude Hamas also breed internal tension amongst Palestinians that in turn fuels external tension with Israel. This is why you've got to work hard at every front of conflict to overpower negative drives to commit acts of cruelty and hostility. The entire habit of human relations has to be reformed at multiple fronts of conflict. It just reminds me of Powell. I think his name was John Wesley Powell, who went out west when the Native Americans were still living there. And he didn't even carry a gun. And the Native Americans got along so well with him, they saw he meant no harm. In fact, he even was creating a language book of the Ute Indians. Those are the kinds of relations we want to role model. Those are our heroes. It's critical to understand the existence of multiple fronts of conflict within each side of a publicized conflict. So the fronts amongst Israelis, the fronts amongst Palestinians. Not to downplay any of the fronts, but to emphasize the futility of violence. If one believes there's only one front of conflict, it can be too easily believed that the war to end all wars will solve once and for all a major conflict and enable everyone to live in peace and harmony. It's just not true. Wars don't end wars. Wars only give people practice in acquiescing to the violent solutions of the violent. And tension at any front of conflict can mirror back and exacerbate the tensions at other fronts of conflict, even tensions within families. Solutions to conflict should strive to address as many fronts of conflict as possible with a nonviolent cooperative approach. You know, in the American culture of violence, in the movies and some of the music, it's a negative influence. I think some of these movies are created to try to make us think, oh yeah, rah, 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 we'll go kill the Russians, we'll go kill the terrorists, which itself is horrible and immoral and a display of ignorance. But it comes back to haunt the nation, as Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said. The violence we perpetrate abroad comes back to haunt the culture here. You absorb it in how you relate to people. Consequence number 14 of this system of apartheid in Israel and the consequence of supporting it. Further loss of U.S. credibility for failing to impartially uphold international law. The U.S. government has a shameful tradition of a double standard system of morality with regard to international law and the UN Charter. It allows itself and its allies to flaunt international law and the UN Charter, but if its enemies violate or even possibly violate international law and the UN Charter, then this is seen as an abomination worthy of severe condemnation and punishment. They say, oh, Putin must stand trial, even though the U.S. presidents have done much more violence. You know, have been at the head of much more violence, and without provocation. I wrote in one of my earlier essays and videos is about these double standards with regard to the UN Charter. Therefore, if the U.S. government ever hopes to move beyond prejudice and rise above double standards, it ought to recognize when its own actions and those of its allies, including Israel, have violated international law and the UN Charter. As the authors in Foreign Affairs write, the U.S. government should recognize its role in creating the current apartheid state by shielding Israel at the UN from Security Council resolutions of condemnation, by arming it with immense military aid, and by helping create accords that discount the legitimate needs of Palestinians. With regard to Israel and Palestine, UN Special Rapporteurs Francesca Albanese, Balakrishnan Rajagopal, and Paul Gaviria Betancourt stated in an article dated February 13th, 2023, February of this year, quote, "The systematic demolition of Palestinian homes, erection of illegal Israeli settlements, and systematic denial of building permits for Palestinians in the occupied West Bank amounts to homicide. Direct attacks on the Palestinian people's homes, schools, livelihoods, and water sources are nothing but Israel's attempts to curtail the Palestinians' right to self-determination and to threaten their very existence. Israel's tactics of forcibly displacing and evicting the Palestinian population appear to have no limits. In occupied East Jerusalem, which is in the West Bank, tens of Palestinian families, I think I meant to say tens of thousands, I just have tens, probably tens of thousands, of Palestinian families also face imminent risks of forced evictions and displacement due to discriminatory zoning and planning regimes that favor Israeli settlement expansion, that is illegal under international law and amounts to a war crime. Quote, "The sealing of family homes of suspected offenders and the subsequent demolition of their homes is in fundamental disrespect of international human rights norms and the rule of law. Such acts amount to collective punishment which is strictly prohibited under international law. We regret that impunity prevails, in particular for human rights violations and potential war crimes committed by the occupying power. It is high time for international adjudication bodies to determine the nature of the Israeli occupation and seek justice and accountability for all crimes committed in the occupied Palestinian territory." End quote. So this was written in February of this year. Did you hear all that was going on to Palestinians? And they're saying the Hamas attack of October was unprovoked? And look, Palestinians are arrested because they're suspects of what? Of having committed violence? Look what's being done to them. So they're just supposed to say, oh, fine, kill my mom and dad. Haha, fine, I won't do anything. They're not supposed to defend their families or get mad that their neighbors are shot or tortured or assaulted? Are these Palestinians supposed to just live like robots and not have any feelings for the horrors they see around them? If they're real humans, they're gonna get angry and they're gonna fight back. Because they're in war. They're in war already. And Israel has the nerve, the Israeli government has the nerve to say, now we're in a state of war. The Palestinians have been in a state of war since about 1917. It's just like 9/11. The U.S. says, oh, America's been attacked. Now we're in a state of war. The Egyptians will say that war was already in the 1990s, when the CIA was helping the Egyptian authorities round up Egyptians suspected of fighting against the oppression of the Egyptian brutal dictator. Special rapporteurs, that's who we were quoting, are part of a body of independent experts, the Human Rights Council, within the UN human rights system. They work on a voluntary basis and are not UN staff and do not receive a salary for their work. The U.S. government should take care that its own actions are in accord with these moral and legal principles. It would be so refreshing, a source of pride for Americans, if the U.S. government scrapped its holy code book of double standard morality and upheld a system of impartial justice. You know, the blind to who it is. It's not who you are that makes your action right or wrong. It's the action. That's why they have liberty with a blindfold on. It's not like, oh, if Russia is violent, you're evil. If the U.S. is violent, it's good. No, you don't want violence at all. Including the violence of the Ukrainian civil war, which has been going on for 8 years prior to Russia's military action. It was violence that Russia was trying to stop and prevent non-violently, with no help from the U.S. government. But back to Israel and Palestine. Yes, it is important to care for Jewish people, as it is important to care for any group of people. Anti-Semitism is a horrible attitude and behavior. But we must take care and realize that the Israeli government is not upholding positive values and principles, just like the U.S. government. It's maddening when people think Americans are to blame for their government. We really don't have a voice. I've tried having a voice. We don't. The U.S. government is divorced from us. It's a separate entity. You know. And it's the same with the Israeli government. They don't represent the Israeli population. They certainly don't represent the Jewish population. So now we're on to consequence number 15. The last one in this part 3. Consequence of supporting apartheid in Israel. Further power to a few loud voices who are unrepresentative of most, but representative of Israel's Likud party, AIPAC. It's difficult to imagine that the U.S. population, if adequately informed of the behavior of Israel's government, would support sending funds and military aid to that government and shielding it from UN condemnation. But the U.S. government, instead of being driven democratically by the people, seems more driven by powerful, unrepresentative lobbies. One central player in the intra-Jewish conflict that severely affects U.S. foreign policy making is AIPAC. According to Michael Oren in his book Power, Faith, and Fantasy, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, that's AIPAC, A-I-P-A-C, was founded in 1953 by Isaiah Shai Kenan, a former employee of the Israeli Office of Information at the United Nations. When I checked out its website back in 2021, AIPAC proclaimed its mission statement, and you can look it up now to see what it is. But this was in 2021. Quote, "We are a bipartisan American organization that advocates for a strong U.S.-Israel relationship. The mission of AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, is to strengthen and expand the U.S.-Israel relationship in ways that enhance the security of the United States and Israel. We engage with and educate decision makers about the bonds that unite the two countries and how it is in America's best interest to help ensure that the Jewish state remains safe, strong, and secure." End quote. The website then reads, quote, "America and Israel connected for good," end quote, and includes the explanation that, quote, "America's support for Israel promotes peace, including a negotiated two-state agreement with the Palestinians, and helps deter regional conflict by making clear to potential foes that they cannot defeat the Jewish state. End quote. Notice right away that the goal of AIPAC is not to create bonds of love within Israel, between Israelis and Americans, or between Israelis and its present and potential foes, such as Palestinians and Iranians. Its goal is not to engender feelings of joy and happiness, conditions of impartial justice, fully empathic 360-degree truthful reporting, or harmony through friendship and equality. AIPAC's goals are precisely and narrowly constricted to the safety, strength, and security of Israel by means of intimidating potential foes. How likely is it that all Jews share these goals? Isn't it likely that many would value cooperative dialogue and mutual justice and caring with potential foes? According to AIPAC, deterring regional conflict is not gained by mutual caring, dialogue, and cooperative efforts to ensure that all sides of potential conflict are treated fairly. Instead, conflict is deterred through military might and intimidation, which is why Israel is allowed to have a secret, unmonitored nuclear arsenal of some 80 nukes or more in violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. While the thought of Iran having even one is portrayed by the double-standard groupthink of U.S. political leaders and the U.S. media as downright dangerous and evil. So it's the Muslims who can't be trusted with the bombs, right? Look how friendly and peaceful the Israeli government. Look at the U.S. government. The only government that's dropped atomic bombs. Why are they considered so trustworthy with nuclear weapons? Because they're Muslim terrorists? Because the Muslims are crazy people? No, they're Muslim terrorists because that's the only way they can fight the oppression. Their leaders are authoritarian dictators supported by the U.S. in many cases. Describing itself as a bipartisan organization leaves one with the impression that AIPAC must be sensible and cooperative. Yeah, when you hear that, oh, it's bipartisan supported. After all, we're meant to assume, why would both parties endorse it so routinely if it did not appeal to the common sense and wisdom of both parties? But actually, U.S. foreign policy has been largely bipartisan since the Cold War of the 1950s. And this bipartisanship has not been the wise result of cooperative, reasoned dialogue between two different viewpoints, but rather it has been and continues to be monopartisanship, the domination of the one point of view that's allowed to dominate U.S. foreign policy, whether Americans like it or not. It's akin to having one political party running our foreign policy, with no input from American citizens, save those who are involved in lobbyist groups such as AIPAC. And I know in the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. campaign, they're referring to the two parties as the uniparty. And I refer to it as monopartisanship. It's the same thing. Bipartisanship, it's not a sign of wisdom and cooperation and shared. It's a sign of narrow-minded thinking, one party, one set of thinking that's allowed to rule. By the mid-1970s, this pro-Israel lobby had begun to acquire immense financial and political power, enough to sway congressional opinion. Well, I'd like to be able to sway congressional opinion, wouldn't you? The Jewish population comprises only 2.4% of the adult population. That's according to 2021 Pew Research Center. But AIPAC has enough power to push proposals through both parties and both houses of Congress with little dissent. Why can't the rest of us do that? Yet the undemocratic nature of this power goes much further because AIPAC doesn't even represent all or most American Jews. So, if it represented all Jews, that'd be 2.4% of the population, but it doesn't even represent that. It doesn't even represent all or most Israelis. It's a right-wing, pro-military force, pro-Likud party organization. Kenan, Isaiah Sai Kenan, retired in 1974. And in the 1980s, AIPAC's board was dominated by the Gang of Four wealthy Jewish businessmen. One being Democratic, who later moved right, and three being Republican. The undemocratic challenge for the new executive director, Thomas Dine, I'm sorry, I didn't look up how to pronounce his name, D-I-N-E, was to develop a nationwide network that would influence every member of Congress, even though, quote, Jews make up less than 3% of the American population, concentrated in 9 states, and they voted overwhelmingly Democratic. AIPAC's power over congressional members is used to thwart any peace-leaning U.S. president and any Labor Party-leaning Israeli prime minister. For example, when President Ford replaced Nixon and Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin succeeded Golda Meir, Ford, not too enthusiastic about Rabin, announced it was time for a reassessment of U.S. support for Israel. So Ford wanted to rethink this support for Israel. But Rabin was able to mobilize AIPAC, who in turn was able to persuade both houses of Congress to oppose Ford's plan and cancel the reassessment. So AIPAC had more influence over Congress than the president, or than any of us. But even Rabin, according to Daniel Kurtzer, then Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, was furious, quote, was furious with AIPAC. He felt they were allied with Likud and would undermine him in what he was trying to do, end quote. Rabin and PLO leader Arafat signed the Oslo Accords in September 1993. But while AIPAC officially endorsed the accords, it also tried to sabotage it. And remember, these accords were viewed as a sellout of the Palestinian cause. In 1995, AIPAC encouraged the new Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, to support a bipartisan bill with Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, a step that would enrage Palestinians who wanted East Jerusalem for their own capital. See, here's Jerusalem, and the Palestinians consider East Jerusalem to be their capital. Here's Tel Aviv. So in 1995, AIPAC wanted Congress to support a bill to move the U.S. Embassy. Israel had seized the eastern parts of Jerusalem from Jordan during the 1967 June War. Back in 1984, President Reagan had never supported the idea of moving the embassy and threatened to veto such a bill. In 1995, neither Rabin nor President Clinton supported the bill. So even Rabin didn't support it, nor did Clinton. But AIPAC promoted it, and Congress passed it with an overwhelming majority. President Clinton invoked a national security waiver to prevent its enactment, as has every president since, except for Trump, who in 2017 called for the embassy's transference to Jerusalem, largely in a move to satisfy a particular segment of zealous Christians. And this is democracy. Both U.S. Presidents Clinton and Obama were stymied by AIPAC's power over Congress. Clinton and Prime Minister Netanyahu did not get along because of Netanyahu's support for the aggressive Jewish settlement of Palestinian land. But while Netanyahu had trouble in gaining support from Clinton, Netanyahu, who'd been close to AIPAC since the 1980s, was able to get around the U.S. president by gaining support from the U.S. Congress thanks to AIPAC. Obama admirably stated during his 2008 campaign, quote, I think there is a strain within the pro-Israel community that says unless you adopt an unwavering pro-Likud approach to Israel, that you're opposed to Israel, that you're anti-Israel. And that can't be the measure of our friendship with Israel. Obama hit the nail on the head. There are many different Israeli Jewish voices and many different American Jewish voices. And to act as though the pro-Likud AIPAC, pro-settlement, pro-military force approach is the only one that truly represents Israeli Jews and American Jews is false and bigoted. You know, I'm not pleased with what I think has been Obama's role in Ukraine and towards Russia. But I like his statement here. To say that if you want to be pro the Jewish people, or even pro the state of Israel, it doesn't mean you have to be pro the Likud approach of hostility towards the Palestinians. As Yossi Beilin, a former official in Israel's labor government, observed about AIPAC, quote, they always want to punish the Arabs, ... They are a very rightist organization which doesn't represent the majority of Jews in America, who are democratic and liberal. They want to protect Israel from itself, especially when moderate people are Israel's leaders, end quote. And it's not only democratic U.S. presidents who are angry with AIPAC. In 1991, one of the Gang of Four, Mayor Bubba Mitchell, went in to have a little talk with Republican President Bush Sr., who had decided to delay a $10 billion loan guarantee to Israel largely because of its continuing expansion of settlements on Palestinian land. Bush Sr. wanted to do this. He was opposed to the expansion of Israeli settlements on Palestinian land. The U.S. Congress was backing Bush. Mitchell was convinced of his influence, but he was reportedly shaking afterwards because Bush Sr. had yelled at him. The next year, Israel voted out Yitzhak Shamir and the Likud party and voted in Yitzhak Rabin and the Labor Party. It was not until then, when Rabin scaled back the settlements, that Bush asked Congress for the loan guarantees. AIPAC is simply not representative of Israeli Jews, nor of American Jews, nor of Americans. As Connie Brooke writes in her highly illuminating article in The New Yorker, this is in 2014, today a growing number of American Jews, though still devoted to Israel, struggle with the lack of progress towards peace with the Palestinians. Many feel that AIPAC does not speak for them. The Pew Center's survey found that only 38% of American Jews believe that the Israeli government is sincerely pursuing peace. In a Gallup poll in late July, only a quarter of Americans under the age of 30 thought that Israel's actions in Gaza were justified, end quote. What had happened in Gaza? In early 2009, a truce between Israel and Palestine collapsed. Israel attacked Gaza, and nearly 1,400 Palestinians and 13 Israelis were killed. Later that year, the UN Human Rights Council issued a report based on an inquiry led by South African jurist Richard Goldstone that accused Israel of possible war crimes. Evidently without any concern about what happened in Gaza to Palestinians, and without any purpose of representing American Jewish or Israeli Jewish opinion, AIPAC condemned the report as, quote, rigged, the Goldstone report, and sponsored a resolution to condemn the Goldstone report. In the House, 344 voted in favor of AIPAC's resolution. In reaction to Israel's actions in Gaza, AIPAC pushed the U.S. Senate to pass a resolution in support of Israel's right to defend its citizens. The resolution passed, quote, without a word of dissent. So AIPAC did that. In fact, U.S. Congressman Brian Baird visited Gaza a few weeks after the 2009 Israeli attack, and he remarked on witnessing staggering levels of suffering of families and devastating destruction in Gaza of homes, hospitals, schools, industries, and infrastructure. He also read the Goldstone report and found it confirmed what he himself saw. When Congress was working to condemn the Goldstone report, thanks to AIPAC, Baird remarked, quote, "We have member after member coming to the floor to vote on a resolution they've never read, about a report they've never seen, in a place they've never been. And that's what is called democracy in the United States. It's based on ignorance." So an organization that is unrepresentative of Jews, of Israelis, and of Americans is able to get the U.S. Congress to vote for AIPAC resolutions without having read the resolutions or the Goldstone report or without having learned about Israeli behavior in Gaza. It's able to get Americans to distrust and hate and maybe someday attack Iran. Iran, a nation that's been bossed around for much of the past few hundred years by European and U.S. powers. A nation whose democratically elected leader was toppled by the CIA in 1953 and replaced by the hated Shah. Yet Iran is portrayed as the aggressor. How does this happen so readily? The answer is that great facilitator of surface-level cooperation: money. Connie Bruck quotes Brian Baird, a psychologist who grew up as a child admiring Israel, but who's also sympathetic to Palestinians. He first ran for Congress in 1996. Quote, "The difficult reality is this. In order to get elected to Congress, if you're not independently wealthy, you have to raise a lot of money. And you can learn pretty quickly that if AIPAC is on your side, you can do that. Any member of Congress knows that AIPAC is associated indirectly with significant amounts of campaign spending if you're with them, and significant amounts against you if you're not with them." For Baird, AIPAC connected money amounted to about $200,000 in each of his races. Quote, an inner quote, "And that's $200,000 going your way versus the other way. So it's a $400,000 swing." End of the full quote. How this is any different from bribery is not clear. Yet in 2023, AIPAC's website is bold enough to proudly and shamelessly state that AIPAC, quote, "is the largest pro-Israel PAC political action committee in America, and contributed more resources directly to candidates than any other PAC. 98% of AIPAC-backed candidates won their general election race in 2002, end quote. In other words, AIPAC's going to determine who wins U.S. elections from now on. Throughout the U.S. Constitution, there will be no more voting in the United States. Only AIPAC's purchasing of candidates for the benefit of Israel's Likud party, especially the extremists within it. And AIPAC is proud of this, just as it's proud of Netanyahu's highly undemocratic government that violates international law. If the U.S. government were to continue to support apartheid, to support Israel's government, right or wrong, or to say meaningless words of condemnation with no bite, it's a clear sign that AIPAC and the Likud party, not the American population, control U.S. foreign policy. Have we been colonized? And that's the end of part 3. Thank you very, very much for listening. And in part 4, we'll talk about anti-Semitism and recommendations for foreign policy. Thank you very, very much for listening, for your attention and your caring. Good night.